Okay, so we now turn to Antybu's second video in his Illogical God series, where he critiques the property of omniscience. Now, he first rightfully points out that omniscience, as defined by many modern-day theists and theologians, as God's ability to know the truth value of every proposition with absolute certainty. Now, his main problem, he says, with this is he asks the question, how can God know that he is omniscient here? And well, frankly, the quote he gave from Veritas, he cited from Veritas pretty much explains the objection here. Namely, what Veritas was saying was that the very property of omniscience, the ability that God would know every proposition with absolute certainty, is automatically, the property that God is omniscient is included in that. So by definition, God knows that he is omniscient, and he can't be mistaken. He knows it with infallible certainty, since that's a property of omniscience here. And I noticed there was a little, he wrote right underneath the quote, he said, isn't that like saying God is omniscient because he's omniscient? There's really nothing circular about that. That's just part of the definition of omniscience, namely that God would know with absolute certainty that he is omniscient, which also defeats the next objection he gives, where he asks, well, isn't it possible then that God could be deceived by some ultra-God, which I find really odd, because ultra-God, I mean, what does that mean? I mean, God, remember, is the greatest conceivable being. There can't be anything beyond him. So if there's what he calls an ultra-God, well, then that would be God. So that doesn't even really make sense. And the scenario, by the way, he says that if the scenario that God is mistaken is even possible, then God is omniscient. Well, is not omniscient, sorry. No, the scenario is not possible, because remember, the very definition of omniscience means that God knows the truth value of every proposition with absolute certainty. So if that's correct, then it is impossible for God to be mistaken. So, yeah. Now, at the end of the video, he does lay out his argument in syllogistic form, and it goes like this.
Premise 1. If God exists, he knows the truth value of all propositions with certainty. Premise 2. To know all propositions with absolute certainty, God must know with absolute certainty that the proposition, God is not mistaken, is true. Premise 3. If God is mistaken, he would not know that he is mistaken. Therefore, God cannot know the truth value of the proposition, God is not mistaken, with absolute certainty. And therefore, God cannot know the truth value of all propositions with absolute certainty. And therefore, assuming omniscience is a necessary qualification for God, God cannot exist.
Now, interestingly, I'm not even sure if this is a logically valid argument, frankly, because 3 flat out contradicts premises 1 and 2, because premise 1 says, if God exists, he knows the truth value of all propositions with certainty. And if that's true, then 3, if God is mistaken, he would not know that he is mistaken, just contradicts 1, also contradicts 2, which says to know all propositions with absolute certainty. God must know with absolute certainty the proposition God is not mistaken is true. Well, if that's true, if the first 2 premises are true, premise 3 cannot be true, because if God knows a proposition with absolute certainty, then he cannot be mistaken. So I'm not even sure if it's a valid argument. I mean, premise 3 just seems really misconceived. It's like asking, well, what if a being who could not possibly be mistaken was in fact mistaken? Do you see the problem? It just doesn't even make sense to ask that. So this is this is not a good argument at all, and so I think the argument is not sound. So take care.